It's always good to be home. Kelly and I have spent the last week out of town at polishing the pulpit in Sevierville, and I can tell you, we say this every year, it's always good to be home. There's nothing like being around people that you love. There's nothing like being in your own home, in your own house, and there's nothing like worshiping with the people that you're so familiar with. We were with 5,304 people this past week at polishing the pulpit. One person asked me if we polished that pulpit real well, and I said, it's so shiny you can't even put a light on it. But it's an interesting thing to be there. On Sunday morning, we worshiped with right at 3,000 people. And if you've ever heard 3,000 people sing, it's an amazing thing to hear. And you can see the beauty of God's wisdom in what He has done and all the things that He has provided. I want to bring us into our lesson in a rather unusual way, because this morning I'm going to present a lesson of which I know as soon as you see the words that some people will turn their ears off. Some will be upset at the word that will be on the screen. Others will be behind it, and some will be behind it in a way that I believe is too much. But I want us to know that this morning there are tough issues in our world. They've always been there. And here's a little tip. I think it's true. You tell me if it's not. They're always going to be there. They always have. I want to share with you some advice that I found. I always am looking for little lines of advice that I find interesting. And I recently stumbled upon some advice from children. And this is going to prove a point to us in just a moment. But Patrick, age 10, said, never trust a dog to watch your food. Isn't that true? Boy, that's good advice, isn't it? That's advice we need. Michael, age 14, said, when your dad is mad and asks you, do I look stupid? Don't answer him. He also said, same boy, never tell your mom her diet's not working. It's good advice, isn't it? That's practical. That's things we can know. You go on and look at the things that children have said, and one girl who loves horses said, don't squat with your spurs on. She found the mistake that she had made. And she had practical advice for other people. One boy said, who was 12, don't sneeze in front of your mom when you're eating crackers. It's good advice. Andrew, age 9, says puppies still have bad breath even after eating a Tic Tac. I'm sure that's true. I've never tried that. But you know, that is true. One little girl who was 15 said, if you want a kitten, start out by asking for a horse. One boy said, don't pick on your sister when she's holding a baseball bat. I think he figured that out. One little girl said, when you get a bad grade in school, show it to your mom when she's on the phone. It's good advice, isn't it? You know, children have an interesting way of thinking, and they think of things in a kind of a pure way and in an interesting way. And sometimes as adults, we just don't do that, do we? We tend to make things very complicated. We tend to make things difficult, and we tend to take things in one of two directions. We either take them to the lesser or we take them to the extreme. I'm going to try this morning to hold us right in the middle. I have heard sermons on the very topic we're going to look at today throughout my entire life, as you have. And some have presented it on the lesser side of things. And that's very rare with this subject. But I have heard it, and you probably have as well. Most tend, especially with what we're looking at this morning, to be on the extreme side of things. I want us to be right down the middle. Here's the word. Modesty. Of all the sermons that have been scheduled to preach this year, this is the one I've been the most careful. Would you like to know why I've been careful? I'll tell you. About 3 years ago, I preached on this. And two people here said, "Why did you preach on that?" One person was upset and asked me to never preach on this again. Here's what I know. Just based on this word, a variety of thoughts have hit your minds right now. Some probably are thinking about what they have heard, and most likely from the extreme side of things. Others are thinking what happens when you don't preach on these things and when things get lax in this area. And I'm here to tell you both are equally good thoughts. Others, most likely in our teenage years, are thinking, why is he preaching on me? I'm not preaching on you. Some are probably thinking, am I wearing the right thing this morning? But here's what I want us to do. I want us to simply take an honest approach at the subject. And here's our honest approach. We can go out and get advice. That's why I share with you some advice from children. We can go out there and get advice from a variety and a number of people all day long, and we're going to get a number of different pieces of advice that are different. But here's the standard. In preparing for this, I just typed in the word modesty in an internet search. And I was surprised at the number of articles that exist, whether from a Christian perspective or a worldview perspective, that came up. And we're going to talk about some of those things as we go through. And I was surprised at the way the world looked at this subject. Did you know the world looks at this subject by saying these lines? I read it in about 6 different articles. Does it really matter how long or short a garment is? One writer even put, does that 2 inches of fabric really make a difference? You see, the way the world looks at things, it's very physical. It looks on the surface of things. And I'm here to tell you that the discussion about modesty is not about the surface of things, even though it involves the surface of things, what is covered and what is uncovered. And we'll talk about those words as we go through. But what I want us to do is just do it in a very simple and very methodical way to help us see what's happening inside of the discussion upon modesty. And you know this has to do with what you wear, what you don't wear, what's too long, what's too short, what's too tight, what's too loose. All of that plays into this discussion. I want us to look at the Old Testament. And inside of the Old Testament, we're going to look at 3 different accounts of which I believe tell a story, tell a truth about modesty. Then I want us to look at the New Testament. We're going to look at one passage of which, if you're very much thinking on this subject, we're going to go to that passage. We're going to go to that passage. But then I want us to look at 2 other passages because I want us to get to the heart of the issue. And then I want us to look at something that I've entitled the defining moment. Because I want you to see that when the word modesty or the word immodesty is discussed, it's talking about more than the physical. Yes, I'm talking about what is revealed and what is kept in secret, in what we wear and what we do not wear. But I want to get to the defining moment of the issue and see what's really true and see what really exists. To do this, let's look at the Old Testament as we open. Look with me in Genesis chapter 3. As all of you know, in the book of Genesis, as you open up, you see the beginning of man, and man is created. And man is perfect. And there is no sin in the world. There are no problems in the world. Everything is just as God created it. But you start in Genesis chapter 3 and verse 7, and you read this phrase, and the eyes of them both were opened. Well, pause with me in your mind for just a minute. Why were their eyes opened? What had taken place in which opened their eyes? What has now entered the world that has never been in the world yet? What has taken place in the life of two different people that the entire world has now been changed forever? Well, if you go in Genesis chapter 3 and you go back to verse 1, you read about the serpent who was more subtle than all the others. And you see that he contorted God's word. He challenged man's thought process, and man walked in the ways of sin. God had given man all the instructions that he needed to know. And man chose willingly, of their own free will, of their own free mind, to walk away from God. And thus sin entered the world. And the eyes of them were both opened. And listen to what happens inside of verse 7. And they knew they were naked. Now there's something that I find interesting is looking at children in the context of how they think. If a commercial comes on our television or something else comes on the television and there's a man without a shirt on, Charlie looks at me and goes, "Why is he naked?" You know, it's interesting that children look at things in a pure way. And we cloud that, don't we? We struggle with that. I want you to see what happens here. Man in Genesis 3:7 finally realizes their condition of where they're at. Sin has entered the world, and the first thing they recognize, it's not that sin had entered the world, it's that they were naked. They were uncovered. There was nothing hid back from public eye. So what did they do? Verse 7. They sewed fig leaves together and made themselves aprons. Isn't that good? They recognized they had a problem. They addressed their problem in the way they thought was appropriate. Keep that in your mind for just a minute. And they thought all was fine. You keep reading verse 8. They heard the voice of the Lord walking in the garden in the cool of the day, and Adam and his wife hid themselves from the presence of the Lord God among the trees of the garden. And the Lord God called unto Adam and said unto him, "Where art thou?" Did God need to ask Adam where he was? God already knew where he was. But Adam did not seem to know that. Verse 10, and he said, "I heard thy voice in the garden, and I was afraid because I was naked, and I hid myself." Listen to verse 11. This is very crucial. Who told thee that thou was naked? Who told you that? I'm here to tell you that when sin is in the world, we're already at a deficit. And I'm here to tell you sin is in the world. And Adam and his wife did the best that they could to cover themselves. They made themselves aprons. You know what an apron is. You have an idea of that. But when they heard God in the midst of the garden, what did they do? They still hid themselves. It's interesting as you go over to verse 21, inside of this very context. In verse 20, Adam calls his wife's name Eve. And in verse 21, listen to what happens. Unto Adam also, and to his wife did the Lord make coats of skins and clothe them. You know, they did their best in clothing themselves. But it didn't meet God's standard, did it? Here's lesson number 1. When it comes to modesty, our standard does not meet God's. I'm not going to tell you what's too tight. I'm not going to tell you what's too loose. I'm not going to tell you what's too long, and I'm not going to tell you what's too short. I'm not going to tell you what's too low and what's too high. Here's what I'm going to tell you, and I'm going to say it a variety of ways as we go through today. We need to be covered. We need to be covered. We need to be modest. And here's what we learn, lesson number 1. What we choose may not be inside the standard of God. Let's move to point number 2, Exodus 20. Go there with me. We're not moving very far inside of the history of man. We're really not moving very far in the history of the page of the Bible, but in the history of man, things are going quite well. And it's in Exodus chapter 20, as you start in the beginning of that chapter, that God is speaking words to man. And inside of Exodus chapter 20, there's something that happens that is very familiar to you and me. It's the Ten Commandments. And God is giving laws for man to obey. Now, what I find very interesting is what God does when it comes to worship. We're in worship, right? The answer is yes. We're in the presence of God, right? The answer is yes. Where two or three are gathered in my name, there will I be also. So it's interesting that God is giving His people rules. He's giving them laws to protect them, not to protect the world. And He tells in verse 24, "An altar of the earth thou shalt make unto me, and thou shalt sacrifice thereon thy burnt offerings and thy peace offerings, thy sheep and thy oxen. In all places where I record my name, I will come unto thee, and I will bless thee." What's happening, verse 24? Worship is taking place. Worship was different in the Old Testament than it is in the New Testament. We need to know that. Verse 25, "And if thou wilt make me an altar of stone, thou shalt not build it of hewn stone, for if thou be lift up thy tool upon it, thou hast polluted it." What's he saying, verse 25? Don't do things your way, do them mine. You know, God is the only one who has the authority, who has the ability, and who has the power to say, you do that my way. The reality is we don't have the ability to say that. We like things our way, don't we? But we don't. God does. Now listen to verse 26. This is interesting because we're talking about worship. What can that have to do with modesty? Well, men, listen up for just a minute. We didn't always wear suits. Clothing did not always look like this. Pants weren't a really big thing back then. And that left them open to certain vulnerabilities. So listen to verse 26. "Neither shalt thou go up by the steps unto mine altar." Pause. "Neither shalt thou go up to the steps to whose altar? Mine." Who's mine? The Lord. "That thy nakedness be not discovered thereon." Well, what was the deal with that? Why did God say that? Well, think about this. If someone is going up steps and others are looking up steps and they have the ability to see up the garment, what could that do? Well, that could place impure thoughts, can it? That can change the scenes of where you're at, can it? That can change where you're supposed to be motivated to, can it? God is telling His people that when you go to worship, and He's telling those that go up to the altar, this is what I find so interesting. He said, you cover yourself. He says, you cover yourself. Here's lesson number 2. We need to make sure we know what's happening in our surroundings. Who would have ever thought about that? Would you? Who would have ever thought about that? When you move over into Genesis or Exodus 28, go there with me. I want you to see something. God once again takes care of this for man. And it makes me think from Exodus 20, verse 26, to Exodus 28, verse 40 through 43, that they just hadn't figured it out yet. Because God's going to reiterate this again. And if God ever tells us something twice, He's telling us to pay attention. When you get to Exodus 28 and you go down to verse 40, you read these words. "And for Aaron's sons thou shalt make coats, and thou shalt make them girdles and bonnets, and thou shalt make for them for glory and beauty. And thou shalt put them upon Aaron thy brother and his sons with him, and thou shalt anoint them and consecrate them and sanctify them, that they may minister unto me in the priest office." Pause for just a minute. Who are we talking about? The priest, those that are going to the altar, those that are doing the priestly functions. So he says you clothe them in appropriate clothing. And follow it out again with me down as we go to 42 and 43, especially noticing 42. "And thou shalt make them linen breeches to cover their nakedness. From the loin even to the thighs they shall reach." Why is he doing that? You ever thought about that? I like to ask this question when it comes to Scripture. Why is he saying that? Well, who's going to be going up the steps to the altar? So why, verse 42, make them underpants? Why do that? So that when they're going up the steps to the altar, and those that are down below do not look up the garment and see what should be unseen. You ever thought about that for just a minute? in the context of worship. God warns man 8 chapters ago, and he reiterates it unto us, and he uses this word, nakedness. Now, listen with me here for just a minute. Not all nakedness is wrong. I think sometimes when it comes to the modesty discussion, we try to blanket statement and say nakedness is sinful. Well, that's not true. That's not true, is it? The husband and wife relationship. Matter of fact, you go back to the beginning and you go to the end of Genesis chapter 2. The man and wife were both together. They were naked and not ashamed. You follow out marriage inside of this, and naked is... We're not making blanket statements here. We're talking about covering ourselves up when we must be covered. There are times when nakedness is appropriate, but that is very rare, folks. That is very rare. When they come to this area, their nakedness must be covered. And I want you to see this. It happens in verse 43. And they shall be upon Aaron and upon his sons when they come into the tabernacle of the congregation, or when they come near unto the altar to minister unto the holy place. Why wear those? When do they need to be modest? When they have the opportunity to be immodest. Even the Lord recognizes that they won't wear these all the time. You see, modesty is not about covering up everything all the time, but it's about covering up everything that can be seen by those who should not see it. That's lesson number 2. Here's lesson number 3. Go with me to 2 Samuel. I want you to see this because this is a lesson that I believe that we need to recognize because we live in a world of which we cannot control. Can you control the world? I can't either. And it's in 2 Samuel chapter 11, something very interesting happens. And matter of fact, since this happened, it has been written about in other books of the Bible. It has been talked about in the Old and the New. It's interesting that David, a man after God's own heart, David, a man who led God's people, was not immune to this. Now, first of all, in 2 Samuel 11:1, David should have been at battle. I want you to know that. The king should have been with God's people on God's battlefield with God at their side. That's written in the law of God. He was already in a place that he should have not been. And it's interesting that as he tarried in Jerusalem, still, verse 1, it was evening time. Now, the day and age we're talking about here in 2 Samuel 11 is different than our day. Because I think I can say this as most of you can say, I've never bathed outside, have you? I've never taken a shower outside, have you? This was normal protocol for the day and age we lived. Then they lived. Then they lived. That's not normal for us. I have a feeling that I can say this with a great degree of certainty, but if you were to get on your roof, you probably would not see anyone bathing. But in 2 Samuel 11, verse 2, someone was bathing on their roof, and it's probably where she always bathed, and probably at the time she always bathed, but it just so happened someone was there that shouldn't have been. And what did he see? You read verse 2. David arose off his bed, walked upon the roof of the king's house, and from the roof he saw a woman washing herself. Now here's what happened. David didn't quit looking. And the woman was very beautiful to look upon. This phraseology here, the woman was very beautiful to look upon, gives us the idea that when he saw her, he stopped. And he stayed. I'm here to tell you that in the world we live in, you can't control who you're around. Here's lesson number 3 we learned today, but you can control where your eyes go. This is predominantly something that we would say to men, but I don't think that's something that should be said. I think this is something for men and women. When I was in business school, I took upper-level business management classes and upper-level classes on marketing. Do you know what one of the tools they tried to teach us that would sell a product? Sex. If you can invoke this sexual response, you can sell the product. That's what happened in 2 Samuel 11, 1 and 2. You cannot control who you're around, but you can control you. That's always going to be the case. That's never going to be false. But see, here's what happens as we follow out 2 Samuel 11, 3 and the following. He inquired about her. And what ended up happening after he inquired about her, after he would not stop and leave, instead he stopped and looked? Murder, didn't it? He pulled the battle array back and one man was left until he was dead. You see, when you look at the Old Testament, you'll find that man has its idea of what it should be, but God corrected that. You'll see that in worship, in scenes of worship, God says you must be modest, not modest, and you'll see that man has no control over who is around him. Now, that's the Old Testament. Let's go to the New Testament as we look at this concept of what's taking place. Here's the passage that everyone usually goes to, and I want you to go there with me. It's 1 Timothy. 1 Timothy chapter 2. Matter of fact, we recently taught through this particular scene inside of our Wednesday night class. 1 Timothy 2, verse 9. And I want you to see a phrase that I believe is most appropriate. In like manner also. You know, when it comes to the discussion on modesty, it's usually directional, isn't it? I think most ladies would probably say that every sermon they've heard on modesty was generally presented to them. I don't think that's true. I don't think that should be true. Because of 1 Timothy 2:9, in like manner also, is modesty a problem for men and women? Or is modesty only a problem for women? It's a problem for both, isn't it? All must be modest. In like manner also, that women adorn themselves in modest apparel with shamefacedness and sobriety, and not with broided hair or gold or pearls or costly array, but which becometh women professing godliness with good works. Let the women learn in silence with all subjection. You know what's interesting about this? Yes, it has to do with what you wear. Yes, it has to do with what you're not wearing. But modesty is much deeper than that. And we're going to see that in just a moment when we get to the defining moment. Here's the reality. Men and women must be modest. Modest has to do with what you wear, as in your clothing. Modest has to do with the way you look, if you follow out the verse, not with broided hair or gold or pearls or costly array. No, I'm not saying it's wrong to wear a gold ring. But when you're wearing something that draws all the attention to you, you've lost modesty. It's not just about your clothing. It's about your presentation of you. And when all eyes are upon you, you've lost the concept that's being taught. I believe that's why he told the priests in the Old Testament to cover themselves up with the breeches, the pants that cover all the loins and the groins. Because the context of what people were doing would no longer be on God, and it would be on them. The eye would be drawn. And that's what is being discussed here. But here's the truth. We must be modest. You go over with me to 1 Peter 3. I want you to see this, 1 Peter 3. And we're trying to do this as methodically as we can. So let's just go to 1 Peter 3. And I want you to see something. And ladies, you're probably going to read the third word and say, well, Jonathan, you're presenting this as if this is still just our problem. Just hang with me. I'm not. Just give me a second, and I'll get to what I'm meaning. Verse 1, likewise, ye wives, be in subjection to your own husbands, that if they Obey not the word, they may also without the word be won by the conversation of the wives, while they behold your chaste conversation coupled with fear, whose adorning let not be the outward adorning of plaiting of the hair and of wearing of gold and of putting on of apparel, but let it be the hidden man of the heart, in that which is not corrupt, not corruptible, even the ornament of a meek and quiet spirit, which is in the sight of God a great price. What's the idea behind 1 Peter 3, 1 through 4? Well, number one, it's about salvation. Verse 1, if they're not won by the word, ladies, this is only written to ladies. Never do you find this written about men in the direct way it is written here in 1 Peter 3. That with your conversation, that with your life, if your husband was not a Christian, by the way you lived, you could convert him to Christianity because of your life inside of Christ. Because of the way you obey His word, because of the way you look at His principles. I'm talking about God here and not the husband. By the way you obey God, he can be won without the word. He can be won by the life of the wife. That's point number one in 1 Peter 3, 1 through 4. Point number two has to do with something that builds up on point number one. It's the way you respect God, verse 2. Coupled with fear, coupled with respect. And then there's number 3 and number 4, verse 3 and 4. When we are only focused on the physical, we forget about pleasing God. Whose adorning let not be that outward adorning of the plaiting of hair, of wearing of gold, or putting on apparel. Now we're going to talk about that phrase in just a few moments in our next section entitled The Defining Moment. But here's the point. When you draw people and point people to God rather than your physical appearance, you're getting it right. And that is what modesty is about. It's about removing the I moments to you. Now that has a lot to do, ladies and gentlemen, with what you wear and what you do not wear. How short and how long, how tight and how loose. We'll talk about that in a few moments. Go with me to Matthew 5. I know when you get to the New Testament, you often talk about ladies in the context, and that's the context of the passages. But man, I want to talk to you for a minute. And I've chosen Matthew 5, 27 through 30 to complement back in the Old Testament of 2 Samuel 11. Man, you cannot control your surroundings, but you can control you. It's Matthew 5, pick up with me in verse 7. It's Jesus. Ye have heard that it was said by them of old time, thou shalt not commit adultery. Pause. Don't read any further for just a minute. Thou shalt not commit adultery. Now, I believe every person in this room knows that adultery is wrong. I don't think we have to discuss it. I don't think I even have to say it's wrong. Does anyone want to disagree? I'll give you the moment to do that. We know that adultery is wrong. God has said it was wrong. But I want you to follow some things out. I want you to follow out what happens here. I want you to see some of the root causes of adultery. And I believe one of the main root causes is found here in Matthew chapter 5. You follow down to verse 28. Listen to Jesus. But I say unto you, Jesus is going to take it where we need to hear it, that whosoever looketh upon a woman to lust after her hath committed adultery with her already in his heart. You cannot control your surroundings, but you can control you. There's a difference in men and women. You know that. I know that. Women are very emotionally drawn, and I mean that in a very good and respectable way, ladies. Don't take that as a negative. Men are drawn more physically. I think we understand that. And men, we have to work on that. I want to speak directly to men for just a moment. But what you let your eyes look upon is going into your heart. Maybe you have a problem with pornography. That's a bold statement. Didn't expect that to be said this morning, did you? Maybe you do. It doesn't have to be that way. Maybe you have a problem with those that you can't control around you. David did. Maybe you stop and look too long. I'm here to tell you that you're going to have to control your heart. It's as if he's committed adultery with her in his heart already. Now, that's not saying that he has committed adultery, and that's not saying that that's grounds for divorce. But it's saying what a man allows into his heart, he will dwell on. And you're in control of your eyes, men. I'm in control of my eyes, just as much as ladies are too. This just happens to be just a plain way of putting it. This is usually not a problem for women. It can be, don't get me wrong. Don't hear me say that this is never a problem, because that's not true. But Jesus addressed it at the heart of the issue, and it was David's problem. He had committed adultery in his heart already with her. The Old Testament, the New Testament. Now let's get to the defining moment. We've already said this, and I want it to be on a slide because I want us to see it. This is not a lesson for women alone. I believe in the research that I've done is it's generally presented that way. And I've tried my very best today to make sure I don't do that, because I don't believe that to be true. What this has to do with, and this is some things you'll learn as you research this issue, there are two things that exist. There's what's called modesty culture, and there's what's called rape culture. Now, I don't like either of those two terms, because both of them are wrong. At the very core of what they present, they're wrong. What modesty culture presents is that if you live your life modestly, if you take care of yourselves in a certain fashion, if you wear what is appropriate, nothing in life bad will ever happen to you. That's not the case. That's not the case. There's what's called rape culture, where it hinges on this modesty culture idea. And it's this phrase, and you've probably heard someone say it, well, she was asking for it. That's not true. That's never been true. It shouldn't be true. Neither of those two premises are true. The truth is we must be a part of Christian culture. And sometimes we fail to recognize that. We fail to recognize the reality of what's taking place. Now, here's where we get to a point where I'm going to say something, and I put this on the screen so we could read it, so we could just deal with it as it comes. There's something that has to be said today inside of this discussion that's just going to be true, okay? But somebody's going to be upset. And I don't mean for you to be upset. But I want to say something that is true. We must be honest with ourselves. We're really good at being dishonest. We don't think about that very often, but we're good at being dishonest. We've got to be honest with ourselves with our intents. Here's a good question for you to ask, both men and women. Why are you wearing that? What is your intent? Here's another question, another thought. We've got to be honest with ourselves with our reasons. You know, we reason things out, don't we? If we know something is wrong, don't we try to reason out, well, I'm only doing it because, well, everybody else is doing it. Don't we reason with ourselves like that? If we're honest, the answer is yes. We've got to be honest with our motivations. And we've got to be honest with our actions. Because the truth is, no one's making you or me do anything. You know why I wore a suit today? Because I chose to. You didn't make me do that. I've never been asked to wear a suit. I was told to wear a suit at my wedding. I'll correct that. Once. What you wore today, you chose that. What you wear tomorrow, you're going to choose that. And here's the deal. We're not willing to be honest with ourselves. We're not. Because we want to act like we can be just like culture because culture's being that way. I can be just like everybody else because that's what they're like. And that's simply not true. Well, I can wear this and say it's not a sexual thing, but it really is. Here's one that's going to step on some toes. And folks, I don't mean to step on your toes. But in this discussion, we like to call certain things other things. Let's just take going to the beach, for example. Is there anything wrong with going to the beach? No, sir. Is there anything wrong with that? Not one bit. But what do we usually wear to the beach? Listen, and this is why I said we've got to be honest with ourselves. You can call a bikini all day long a bikini, but it's not. It's a revealer. Pardon the way I'm going to say this. But if you can buy it in a lingerie shop, you shouldn't be wearing it in public. Men and women. We call it a bikini. One person in their article about this modesty culture wrote about the bikini. Matter of fact, it was a woman who was advocating modesty. I was quite shocked. She was an actress, and she wanted Hollywood to change the way they viewed modesty. And she talked about how the inventor of the bikini, and I forgot where it was of which he lived, I think it was France, worked in his family's lingerie shop. And he was trying to invent something new that women could wear to the beach. And he did. And it's still here. Isn't it interesting that something that comes from a lingerie shop to be put into public is called a bikini because someone made it that way? I'm not trying to harp on that, okay? There's nothing wrong with going to the beach. You can be modest at the beach. Matter of fact, there are companies out there that make swimwear that's modest. You can do that if you choose. In the dresses and in the clothes that we wear, did you know a suit could be immodest? Did you know that? It can be. In what we do, are we honest with ourselves? And I'm here to tell you, I'm not sure that we are. I'm not saying that for you. I'm not saying that because I think one of you in this room are immodest this morning. I'm trying to tell you we don't always think in the appropriate way. So we've got to ask this question: are we willing to be honest with ourselves? Now, let's look at one more passage and the lesson will be yours. It's in Matthew 15. Matthew 15. And I want you to look at verses 10 through 20. We're really only going to look at 2 verses inside of this. Matthew 15. And I want you to see verse 10, because I want you to see something that Jesus says, and it's impressive. Matthew 15, verse 10. Just read the red words. Hear and understand. Hear and understand. Verse 11. Not that which goes into the mouth defileth the man, but that which cometh out of the mouth, this defileth the man. What defiles man? What man does. Now go all the way down to verse 19, and let's get to the defining moment. For out of the heart proceed evil thoughts, murders, adulteries, fornications, thefts, false witness, blasphemies. Where did that come? From the heart. And thus I asked you just a moment ago, are you willing to be honest with yourselves? See, we're supposed to be the people that are blameless. We're supposed to be the people who are without rebuke. We're supposed to be the people who are shining as lights like in the midst of the rest of the world. And let me tell you, you can't do that if you look like the world. You cannot shine like a light if you look like the rest of the world. It's never going to be. But yet you've got to look as God would have you to be. We've looked at the Old Testament. We've looked at the New Testament. And hopefully we've noticed the defining moment when it comes to this subject. I know this morning that I've spoke longer than I normally do, but I wanted to make sure that we were direct with what we were saying, we were fair and honest with what we were saying, and that we were accurate with the text. I believe that's got to be true in our preaching and in our classes. I know that this subject is difficult. I know it is. It's always going to be difficult. That's why it's a tough issue. That's why it's hard. It's going to be tough. But it doesn't have to be. It doesn't have to be. Because you can give your life to the Lord and you can be His. Maybe this morning you need to become a child of God. Water is ready. Clothes are ready. Have you ever wondered why we have baptismal garments? Part of that has to do with modesty, just to let you know. So that in our assemblies things are modest. Have you ever thought about that? Why do we have baptismal garments? It plays into our very discussion we're having today so that things are covered. But maybe you this morning need to become a child of God. Everything's ready for you. Is your heart ready? I hope it is. Hope you're willing to be baptized this morning if you need to become a child of God. Maybe you're a child of God this morning and you recognize you need to come home. Maybe there's sin in your life. Maybe your thought process needs to be changed. Maybe you just need prayers of encouragement. That's what today is about. It's about us having an opportunity to respond inside of our worship to the Lord and to have this moment to recognize that we're not perfect and that our decisions are not always perfect and that we can be with the Lord. Let's stand and sing and let's respond accordingly.